Chris and I are glad to be back from Alberta, Canada. We had a great week of hiking in the Canadian Rockies, and we're just so in awe of God's creation out there. Just really awe-inspiring. It was great to have Pastor Bonnie speak last week, and we were able to tune in. You noticed, and if you haven't heard her talk on faith and healing, I definitely want to encourage you to go back and listen to that. An amazing story she told. Well, tonight we look at the book of Ruth. So, sandwiched between two long, sprawling narratives in our Old Testament, the book of Judges and then 1st and 2nd Samuel, we find this little book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters long, but it contains so many intertwining themes, so we can't just boil it down to one simple moral lesson. And, the truth is, we can't ever really do that with the historical narratives in the Bible, because the Bible isn't just a collection of moral lessons. Rather, this little book and the other narratives, they're part of the grand story of God's saving work in the Bible that starts in Genesis and proceeds from there. And so, how does this little book fit into that drama? Especially when it doesn't mention Jesus, it doesn't mention a Messiah, it barely mentions God. And in fact, it's about the life of a 40-something-year-old immigrant woman, not even a woman of Jewish heritage. Well, tonight we're going to focus on one aspect of that story. The idea is called Hesed. Hesed. You have to say that right, but we anglicize it. And those of you who like to take notes, you would transcribe it as Hesed, Hesed. And that's how I'll be pronouncing it. Now, the only other book in the Bible named for a woman is what? Yeah, that's right, Dennis. The book of Esther. But Esther is a queen, and Ruth is an immigrant. She's a widow. And some sources say that she was probably about 40 years old when she married Boaz, which takes place in the story. And, we wouldn't exactly call her a celebrity. We don't hear her voice in this book the way we hear Isaiah's voice in the book named for him, or Job or Jeremiah, where they're making these grand pronouncements. I mean, Ruth only gets 12 sentences in the entire book. And yet, here it is. Well, before we read our Bible text tonight, I want to tell you a little about Ruth's background. And a very thing to know about Ruth is she's a Moabite. A Moabite. Right. What's that? A Moabite. Well, the Moabites were from the region called Moab. They were a Semitic people who lived in what is now West Jordan, really the other side of the Dead Sea from where God's people lived in Judah and then Israel. And in fact, and this is important, in the book of Numbers in the Bible, God condemns the Moabites for their worship of false gods and sexual immorality. But here she is, Ruth, a Moabite, a middle-aged immigrant woman from a scorned people. She's a person outside the tribe. She doesn't have a job. She probably doesn't even speak the language of the Jews, the ancient Israelites. And in our vernacular of today, we'd say she's a non-resident alien. She becomes a non-resident alien. No green card, no citizen rights. She's an immigrant who speaks a foreign tongue. So right out of the gate, we can observe that God's choice to include Ruth in the story of divine redemption shows that his grace is for all people, and that no person is too insignificant or too foreign or too much the outsider to be used for his glory. In fact, Ruth, our non-resident alien from a faraway country speaking a foreign language, she becomes the great-grandmother of King David, who, of course, is an ancestor of Jesus. Wow, wow. Well, this is not a sermon tonight about immigrants. We'll do that another time. But I really want to lead with that point that God chooses to use an immigrant woman for his glory. I mean, immigrant status doesn't matter to God. No one is outside the circle of possibilities for God. Now, besides being Jesus's ancestor, another way that God will use Ruth is to teach us about a powerful word, a Hebrew word called hesed, which I mentioned. This concept that holds deep significance for our lives as believers. So tonight we'll explore the story of Ruth with that theme in mind, that hesed. We're going to discover how hesed can transform our relationships, our communities, and our faith. Okay, so we pick up the story of Ruth in chapter 1, verse 6. And here's what's happening. A Jewish woman named Naomi is living in Moab, this foreign country I mentioned. And Ruth is her daughter-in-law. Okay, so hear now the word of the Lord as recorded in Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 18. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them back in Judah, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living in Moab, and she set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah, where God's people lived. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, what I want to do tonight is to tell you a bit about Ruth's story. And then I want to tell you a modern day story of Ruth. I mean, both are stories of Hesed. And my goal is to show you this idea, this relentless loyalty that God shows to us. And we see this in this story. And in the modern day story, I'll tell you. And we can apply those ideas to our own lives. Well, let's start with Ruth's story, and then we'll talk about the idea of Hesed a bit more in here too. So we start with Ruth. Ruth lived in the midst of an era marred by famine and spiritual decline. But as we read, our story actually doesn't start with Ruth, does it? It starts with Naomi. Naomi, she's a woman who faced overwhelming loss, and she's living in a foreign land, Moab. After about 10 years there, she lost not only her husband, but her two sons as well. She has two beloved daughters in law, but no husband and no sons. So Naomi makes the difficult decision to leave the life that she and her family have established in Moab and then return to her native Judah. But what about her daughters in law, Orpah and Ruth? Well, they're widows too, and they're Moabites, not Judeans. Naomi encourages her daughters in law to stay in Moab with their families and to find new husbands. Well, this is a wise suggestion because in those days, women without a husband were in a very vulnerable position. And these two women could most likely remarry easily. They still were marriageable and they had no children. So Orpah considers this, and with a heavy heart, she agrees to stay in Moab. Ruth, however, we learn she remains with her mother in law, Naomi. And she further solidifies her bond with Naomi with her declaration in verse 17. It's probably a famous declaration. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and I will be buried there too." Remember that famous verse. And in that declaration, we encounter this powerful concept, Hesed. Hesed. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about what this concept means, and then I'll tell you the other story that will hopefully, together, these two stories will vivify this idea. And my hope for you is that we could really embrace this idea of Hesed and to be able to show it to each other as a church, to show Hesed to God, and to receive the deep and abiding Hesed from God that He has shown to each one of us. Okay, well, what is Hesed? Well, Hesed is a deep, selfless love that goes beyond mere duty or obligation. And we could say that Hesed has at least three components. One, relentless loyalty. Relentless loyalty. The second idea, unwavering kindness. So, relentless loyalty, unwavering kindness. And the third idea is radical inclusion. Radical inclusion. Well, let's unpack these. So, what is the essence of Hesed? We start with relentless loyalty. Well, Ruth's steadfast loyalty towards Naomi really demonstrates Hesed in action. I mean, despite her own personal struggles, Ruth clings to her mother in law and vows never to leave her side. And we notice that Ruth's commitment is not based on convenience or personal gain, but it arises from a deep reservoir of love and loyalty. So Hesed is characterized by this relentless loyalty, this willingness never to abandon, but to persevere through thick and thin, just as God showed His people through the ages. Now, Hesed is loyalty, but it's not only loyalty. It's also, the second idea, unwavering kindness. You could say steadfast loving kindness. That's how it's often translated in the Bible. Loving kindness, steadfast loving kindness. I mean, we don't really have a word for it in English. I mean, Hesed involves love that is deep and kind and forever giving. And it's this loyalty that goes with it. I mean, it sets aside my rights in order to reach out to others in kindness. And that's our God, isn't it? He has shown us Hesed in Christ, this deep, loving kindness and loyalty. And we're called to show each other this unwavering kindness and love and show it to each other, especially in the church, but even outside the church, to be people of Hesed. Well, the third idea of Hesed is radical inclusion. So Ruth's story reveals this radical inclusiveness, especially when she marries Boaz. So Ruth, remember, she's a Moabite woman, a woman from a scorned tribe, and yet she's embraced by the Israelite community in this book. And later in the story, Boaz, who's called a kinsman redeemer, I love that in this book, he later marries her. He marries a Moabite woman, an immigrant. And thus he acts as an agent of Hesed by welcoming Ruth into his fields and by providing her protection and provision. And again, this isn't a sermon on immigrants, but I have to say, in a world divided by barriers and differences and prejudices, Hesed calls us to break down those barriers and extend love and acceptance to all. Like Ruth and Boaz, we are called to be instruments of Hesed and to invite others into our communities and our church and to embrace them without reservation. Hesed. Its essence is relentless loyalty, unwavering kindness, and radical inclusion. Well, now I'm going to tell you the modern day story of Ruth, and I'm hoping this really vivifies this idea for you. Well, this story begins with a woman named Tracy. And Tracy is a friend of mine and Pastor Bonnie's, going back to third grade when we first met Tracy. Third grade. So in those days of the baby boom and overcrowded classrooms, Bonnie and I were transferred to another school. We were 8 years old. We didn't know anybody in this new school, but there comes Tracy. She made us her friends. Well, the next year we went back to our old school, but guess what? Tracy remained our friend. And through those years as young kids and then middle school, we kept hanging out together. I mean, she was a believer too, and that made that bond easy, I guess, in that regard. So, Tracy would come over to our house and we'd have so much laughter and fun. And my mother would make cookies and maybe we'd help and join in. I mean, those were great years of friendship and fun. And now, one day in seventh grade, Tracy came to us and told us her parents were moving to Africa. Africa. I mean, we barely knew where that was, right? Her parents were going to be missionaries. But Tracy didn't want to go, and her parents really didn't know what to do, because if Tracy went as an eighth grader, she'd be in one school for 1 year, and just as soon as she got kind of settled, she'd have to switch and go to another school and go to a boarding school. And so her parents talked to my parents. And together they all decided, how about if Tracy just lives with us for a year and then joins her folks in Kenya the following year when she would start high school at the boarding school for missionary kids? Well, that's what happened. And so my folks became her legal guardian. That's what they had to do because she's still a minor. And so they kept her in that year in our home, apart from her folks from in Africa. Well, Tracy eventually left for Africa, but she had grown close to my folks in that year, especially my mother. And when she returned to the US to go to college, well, whose home do you think she showed up at on over the holidays each year? Well, sure, it was our home. And we all grew so close that we called Tracy our sister, and she called our mom, Mum. That was the name we called her as kids. Well, years passed. We all grew up and had families of our own. Tracy settled not far away from my folks. Her folks remained in Africa all those years. And as my folks aged into their 70s and 80s, there was Tracy. My father died in his 80s, and there was Tracy right there with us to hold the hand of my mother, Mum, in comfort. Later, as my mother now lived alone, Tracy would visit my mother and take her to lunch. And my mother lived on into her 90s, and there was Tracy. In the last weeks of my mother's life, there was Tracy. My two other sisters, and Tracy and I, we'd take turns giving care to our mother and being with her. Tracy, spelled us off and took a day, as the weeks went on and she declined. I mean, she took a day each week. I mean, this was an ongoing commitment. It was amazing. And, finally, of course, our mother died peacefully with those she loved at the ripe age of 92. Well, out in the parking lot after her funeral, darkness had fallen, and Chris and I were getting into our car. We were some of the last people to leave. And Tracy, across the way there, she called out to me. She said, "Beth, I need to tell you something before you go." And so we approached each other. Our faces are still damp with tears. And Tracy said to me, "Beth, you need to know this. You need to know this. Your mother, Mom, saved my life. She saved my life." Well, I looked at her puzzled. And Tracy said, "She saved my life because she took me in and loved me when I had no one else. She helped me in ways that you have no idea about. I would not be who I am today without your mother." Hesed, relentless loyalty, unwavering kindness, radical inclusion. I mean, my mother already had 5 children. She didn't need one more, but she took in Tracy. I mean, this is a modern day story of Ruth, don't you think? Two women showing Hesed and its transforming power. Well, in Ruth's story, Hesed becomes the catalyst for healing and restoration. When Ruth demonstrates love and loyalty towards Naomi, their lives are transformed. The bitter grief that Naomi carries begins to dissolve and hope emerges. The women are sustained and they're fortified in their loneliness by their love for one another, their Hesed. And likewise with Tracy and my mother. Her name's Betty. Betty, I mean, something good and restorative happened between them. What exactly happened between these two women? Honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever really know what it was that Betty did that saved Tracy's life. She saved my life. That's what Tracy said. It was Hesed, not shown in a single moment or even a few weeks or a year. Betty showed Tracy Hesed that lasted for decades, taking her in all those years and always including Tracy. And, my mother, I mean, I'm kind of making her out to be a saint, but she's just an ordinary person. She's an ordinary person with her flaws, but God gave her the capacity to show this hesed, this unwavering kindness and love to Tracy. It was true hesed, and Tracy returned that hesed. Well, friends in Christ, this is what God shows towards us: relentless loyalty, unwavering love, a radical inclusion of us into his family, calling us his adopted sons and daughters. Hesed, it's who God is. Relentless, radical love with abiding loyalty. I mean, he yearns to show Hesed to each one of us. And all we need to do is open our hearts to him and believe in his steady, unwavering, deep kindness and love towards us. And, likewise, when we embody Hesed in our relationships, amazing things can happen. I mean, showing steady kindness and love, we too can become agents of healing and restoration in a broken world. By extending hesed and goodwill to those around us, we create spaces where wounds can be mended, relationships can be reconciled, and hearts can experience the redemptive power of God's love. So tonight, brothers and sisters, let us be challenged to live lives marked by Hesed, by compassion, loyalty, commitment. In a world that so often emphasizes self centeredness and individualism, Hesed calls us to a higher standard of love, a nuanced understanding. Hesed calls us to go beyond one or two, quote, random acts of kindness, as our culture likes to call it, and be people who show a deep, relentless loyalty and steadfast, loving kindness to those around us. Amen.